Good afternoon. I'm Professor Robert, History Department. Since President Ayers, I can also introduce myself as the Senior Civil War Historian at the University of Richmond. It's my pleasure, high pleasure, to introduce Gary Gallagher, the John L. Now Professor in History of American Civil War at the University of Virginia. Professor Gallagher is a native of Los Angeles. He received his bachelor's degree from Adams State College in Colorado and his master's and PhD from the University of Texas at Austin. At the University of Virginia in 1998, he taught 12 years at Penn State University. He's the author and editor of more than 30 books. Some of his most recent books, the most recent book being The Union War, published by Harvard in 2011, which complements his 1997 book with Harvard, The Confederate War, Lee and His Generals in War and Memory, The Myth of the Lost Cause and Civil War History, which he co-edited with Alan Nolan. Popular art shaped what we know about the Civil War. Dealing with the Civil War, 3 alone with the University of North Carolina, one called Civil War America, which has 95 titles, Military Campaigns of the Civil War, which has 9 titles to date, and the series which is sort of in the making now, the Littlefield History of the Civil War, which will eventually have 16 volumes, each published by truly major scholars in the Civil War period. In addition to his extensive publication record, he is also, as many of you know, a superb teacher as well. He has recently been the recipient of the Cavaliers Distinguished Teaching Professorship at UVA, the highest teaching award. In addition, he has played a very critical role, including serving as president, of 2 major Civil War organizations, the Association for the Preservation of Civil War Sites, now called the Civil War Trust, and also the Society of Civil War Historians. I may add as well that his many graduate students, every year growing, are also now having a significant impact on the profession, and I know Gary is particularly proud of their accomplishments as well. Let me finish by just a short personal note. Probably no single paragraph as a Civil War historian that I've ever read has had more impact on me than a paragraph that Professor Gallagher wrote a few years ago. So I'd like to read just part of that paragraph and you'll see why. It surely is not in one of his major works. I don't think he'd call it his major work at all, but it was in Robert Brent Toplin's edited work, Ken Burns' The Civil War, in which a number of historians wrote critiques of the Burns series. Gary's essay was called How Familiarity Breeds Success, Military Campaigns and Leaders in Ken Burns' The Civil War. Now the reason this paragraph, as I'll read in a moment, a few sentences, had such an impact on me is you should know that my orientation towards the Civil War is much less military than Gary's is and much less political than others, primarily social history. But when this book came out in the mid-90s and I read these sentences, it had an enormous impact on the way I teach. So let me read just a few lines. In this essay, Professor Gallagher wrote, "Millions of people north and south eagerly followed the progress of Union and Confederate armies on a daily basis, according more attention to strategic maneuvers and battles than to any other non-military topics favored by modern scholars. Perceptions about the military situation influenced how people voted, whether they bought government bonds, and many of their other activities." Now, I can't comment on how other Civil War scholars may have felt when they read that, but those words really did have and have had a major impact on the way I teach. It made me reassess what a true Civil War teacher needs to do, and not just to focus on social or political or what we may feel important today, but we always have to consider what those people were most interested, and they were interested not just the military in terms of the military history, the battles and campaigns, but every day they were reading in the newspaper about those, and it affected the decisions they made. Well, then I'd like to introduce Professor Gallagher, who will speak command relationships during the Civil War.
I'm going to switch to a different microphone. Can you hear me with this? Yes, okay. All the way in the back you can hear me. Thank you very much for that. I love to come to the University of Richmond. I end up here one way or another fairly frequently. Even before Ed was on the scene, and I knew Ed before he was a Civil War historian. That's how far back we go. Ed used to smile when I would say the Civil War is really the most important thing to understand about United States history. If you don't come to terms with that, you have no chance of understanding much of anything else, and he'd smile and sort of look off. And now Ed's a Civil War historian. I'm quietly triumphant. What I'm going to talk about today are, it sounds as if I'm going to give you a general talk on command relationships during the Civil War, and I'm not, because I have 40 minutes. It's now 22 minutes until 5. I'm supposed to talk for 40 minutes and then take 20 minutes worth of questions, which is what I'm going to do. But I don't have time to talk about that whole subject. What I'm going to do is focus on what I think are the two most important command relationships during the Civil War. The two relationships that had the greatest impact on how the war unfolded. And the two relationships that, if we really understand them, will reveal a great deal about the broader framework of the war. And those relationships are civil-military relationships, one on each side, between Abraham Lincoln and Ulysses S. Grant on the United States side, and between Jefferson Davis and R.E. Lee on the Confederate side. Those two relationships are going to be my focus. But before I get to those, I want to just remind you of some things that I think, and this may be so stunningly obvious to you that you're going to just sort of zone out for a minute until I move on to something else. But I think these are things anyone thinking about, reading about, trying to come to terms with the Civil War needs to keep in mind. I know there's some of you who don't keep this in mind, so maybe you're the main ones that I'm talking to. So you probably do know, first, we need to keep in mind the scale. When we think about how these relationships played out, we need to remind ourselves that the scale is gigantic during the American Civil War, far greater than in any of our other wars in terms of its direct impact on the largest percentage of people in both the United States and the Confederacy. If we were mobilized now to the degree Americans were mobilized during the Civil War, we'd have 30 million people in uniform. And if we were mobilized to the degree the Confederacy was, we'd have 50 million people in uniform. We'd have 14 million dead if we lost at the rate that the Confederacy lost. Compared to any other war we've been in, the Civil War is singular in terms of that impact. The only one that comes even close is the American Revolution in terms of how many people it directly touched. So the scale is important. The scale of destruction, the scale of loss, all of that is on a different level, of course, because the war took place here rather than somewhere else. So I think the scale is something we need to keep in mind. The second thing we need to keep in mind is that these are two democratic republics at war. The military events do not unfold in isolation during the American Civil War. Military commanders don't get to decide they want to do X or Y and then just do it because they want to. There are tremendous political pressures brought to bear throughout the war on both administrations that were trying to oversee this tremendous conflict. And you have these odd situations where both Abraham Lincoln and Jefferson Davis had to deal with powerful politicians who wanted to put uniforms on. It would be the equivalent of having a Sunday morning newspaper. You open it up and say, that's interesting, Nancy Pelosi's the commander in Afghanistan. That's what you have during the Civil War. You have Benjamin Butler commanding an army. You have the former Speaker of the House, Nathaniel Prentice Banks, commanding the United States armies. It sounds much odder when you put it that way. Newt Gingrich is a major general now. He is commanding in a key theater. That's what happens during the Civil War. And if you have to deal with those kinds of pressures, the repercussions can be significant in terms of what happens when those people are in charge. Nathaniel Banks managed to lose battles and fumble campaigns in every field. Got moved around wherever he went, you got the same result. But he's an important fellow. So there are political connections that help dictate not only who puts on uniforms, but the allocation of resources. Which theaters are going to get more attention? Which campaigns are going to be considered most important? It's not always because militarily they would be the most important. It's because there are all kinds of other non-military factors brought to bear, and those are factors that in our system, which is also the Confederate system, of course, because the Confederates wrote their Constitution. With the U.S. Constitution open right here, just copy it over here and make the adjustments for slavery. You've got your new Constitution with some other things. Civilians are in control in both of these systems. They're in control. Doesn't mean all the generals are aware of that, but the best ones are. Grant is, Lee is, George McClellan isn't, Joseph Eggleston Johnston isn't, but the best ones are. They defer to their civilian leaders because that's how the systems work. Keep that in mind. We also need to keep in mind, and this is really important, that either side could have won the American Civil War. Either side could have. We have this lost cause notion that it's a hopeless fight on the Confederate side. This is a post-war formulation. Either side could have won. If there had been a Las Vegas in 1776 and 1861, the odds against United States success in the Civil War would have been, we would have put our money on the Confederates. That would have been the smart bet, not putting our money on the colonists to the war. We need to keep that in mind. Not a hopeless war. The key thing for the Confederates is they have a much lower bar to negotiate. It's much easier for them. All they need is a tie. A tie is a win for the Confederacy. The United States, the Confederacy does not have to project military power into Massachusetts. It does not have to threaten Detroit. Iowa is safe from Confederate armies during the Civil War. Maine didn't tremble at the thought of the Army of Northern Virginia coming near. But the United States, as we know, in the end, had to project its military power into virtually every corner of the Confederacy. Not most of Florida, but almost everywhere else. Almost everywhere else. So the conditions for success are easier to meet on the Confederate side. And the key on both sides is the civilian population. Whichever civilian population gives up first, that is the side that doesn't win. That's the way wars go in our system. It doesn't really matter who's winning the war militarily sometimes. There's enough gray hair in this room to remember Vietnam very well. I'm not the only one. It's when the population finally says, that's enough. This isn't a war we're going to support anymore. The war's over. It doesn't really matter what conditions are on the battlefield. And therefore, you can get the situation in the middle of the bloody summer of 1864, when by any rational measure, United States military forces were crushing the Confederates in significant ways. You get the phenomenon that moment is the moment of greatest despair behind the lines in the United States. That is the greatest crisis for the United States. That, not Gettysburg. We have Gettysburg just drilled into our minds as a great turning point. Just get that out of your minds. Probably none of you have it there, but I've heard others do. Gettysburg is not among the top 6 turning points of the war. I'd use a bigger number, but some of you may love Gettysburg, so I won't push too hard on that. It's the summer of 1864, when by all rational measures, the Confederacy was losing, and clearly losing. The people in the United States didn't think so. The Republican Party thought about dumping Abraham Lincoln. And there was a spreading despair that was the greatest of the war on the part of the United States. So don't assume, this is what I call the Appomattox Syndrome. You start at the end of the story and assume that's the way it's going to end. You assume it's going to end with the United States victory and with emancipation in place. Why do you assume that? Well, because it did. And because it's a modern nation, it's the United States fighting against an anachronistic nation, if you even concede that the Confederacy is a nation, which of course it was. This is not some squabble, little family squabble, and a bunch of people sort of get upset and shoot for a while. It's a war between two modern mid-19th century nations, one of which didn't last very long. But it is a nation. It is a nation. And we need to keep that in mind, and keep in mind that that nation that didn't last very long and seemed so anachronistic but really wasn't, could have won the war. I also think it's important to keep in mind that the two presidents I'm going to talk about now faced the greatest crisis of any chief executives in our history. They did. It's so sad that we live in a time of the demented 24-hour news cycles, when the people who read the news and then stop to talk about history, sadly, have their sense of history goes back to Tuesday. If it happened before Tuesday, they're not aware of it, and so everything that happens is the worst, the biggest, the only time. We've never been as divided as we are now. How many times did you hear that during the presidential election of 2008? We've never been this divided, never. I can think of one place we've been, one time when we've been more divided than that, because I teach about it. The last time I checked, we weren't slaughtering each other in 2008. No president's ever been attacked the way George Bush was, or the way President Obama is. Really? The only way you can reach that conclusion is not to read anything from the past. And that has a liberating effect. If you don't read anything, you can argue or believe anything you want to. But if you read anything, you know that Abraham Lincoln, were he given the option, would say, what is George Bush's worst day? I want that one every day. That's the day I want every day for my presidency. Because my bad days are really bad days compared to that one. George Bush has not dealt with Cold Harbor in the middle of an overland campaign that would cost 1.1 million casualties now in a 6-week period. If we got news of 1.1 million casualties in a 6-week period, whatever we were doing would stop. Whatever we were doing, it wouldn't have gotten that far. Wouldn't have gotten that far. So I think it's important to keep in mind this comparative dimension and make those adjustments as you try to understand something such as these command relationships. All right, I'm going to talk about Lincoln a little bit and Davis a little bit as chief executives and their styles of functioning as commander-in-chief. And then I'll talk about the relationships with their two most important generals. And we should have plenty of time for questions or discussion or arguing when all that is over. And let me start with Lincoln and Davis as commanders-in-chief. Once again, if there had been someone offering odds on which of these two individuals would do the better job as commander-in-chief, everyone would vote for Jefferson Davis. Because what does Lincoln bring to the presidency? What is on his resume that prepared him to preside over this gigantic enterprise? And the answer is almost nothing. Almost nothing. He brought no administrative experience to the job. He'd been a one-term congressman, as you know, from Illinois, a Whig for one term, during the war with Mexico. He's a successful lawyer. He's not a backwoods bumpkin, as he's sometimes portrayed. He's a sophisticated, successful lawyer who takes on all kinds of cases as he goes through his life. His most famous race is the one he lost. He got more votes, but he lost to Stephen Douglas in the senatorial election of 1858 in Illinois. Military experience, he was a company commander, a captain of Illinois militia for a brief time during the Black Hawk War in the 1830s. That's it. That is the extent of his military experience. And he would tell a joke on himself, as he often did. He had his little company going across a field one day, and there's a fence at the other end. A number of you are familiar with this. And there's a gate. And he has his troops in line, not in column. And he can't remember the order to get them from being in line to being in column, which would allow them to walk through the gate area in the fence. And he got closer and closer and finally just said, halt, fall out, reform on the other side of that fence. Which is a practical solution to the problem, but not the kind of commands you want from someone who's going to try to control troops in a difficult situation. He didn't bring anything to the job in that regard. What he brought was a first-rate intellect and a willingness, something all of our presidents surely have not had, to listen to people who knew more than he did about something and to learn. And the principal person he learned from early on was Winfield Scott, who was the perfect person to teach him. Winfield Scott's one of the 5 great soldiers in United States history. in my view. For Civil War types, he's often a kind of punchline because he's far past meridian physically by that point. He's 75 and he's huge, 350 pounds, he can't get around. But his mind still worked very well. He, in effect, sketched out the grand strategy for the United States for the whole war. Essentially did what he suggested in the spring of 1861. But Lincoln learned a lot from Winfield Scott. He learned from Scott. Scott left the stage in the autumn of 1861, went off to West Point because he couldn't stand George B. McClellan anymore. But he did learn from Scott. Lincoln, as the war went on, developed a few ideas that he believed were crucial to winning the war. And let me just give you these very quickly. Number one, he believed that Confederate armies, not places, should be the principal target of United States military forces. As he told Joseph Hooker in 1863, Richmond is not, don't obsess about Richmond. If you destroy the Army of Northern Virginia, Richmond is yours. The key is the Army of Northern Virginia, not the places. Lincoln argued this, he pushed this. Early on he didn't understand that, but he came to understand it, and that was one of the key things he tried to do in the course of the war, was to find someone who would take that view. He also learned, and Winfield Scott helped him here, although Lincoln didn't learn it immediately. Early in the war he didn't know this, that just because you put a uniform on someone they're not a soldier. Just because you have a uniform on doesn't mean you're a soldier. Scott told him that, others told him that. Lincoln pushed for an early battle. We got the ignominious Union failure at First Bull Run, partly because of that, but he came to understand it, that training was important and that logistics were important. He came to grasp that. Armies can't just do, I want this army to go do that. You can't just go do that unless its logistical situation will allow it. And that's often very complicated, and it's especially fraught within a mid-19th century context in the winter, when it's really raining, or when you get away from rivers in the Confederacy, because the Confederate transportation infrastructure was poor to begin with, and then in terrible shape as the war unfolded, because both sides would destroy railroads and knock down bridges. And so the United States needed rivers to have really certain avenues of advance. Lincoln came to understand that as well. He did think the Mississippi was critical. He got that from Winfield Scott. He obsessed about the Mississippi River. And I think he over-obsessed about it, especially about Vicksburg. I frankly don't understand what the big deal about Vicksburg was. Because once New Orleans was gone, and it was gone before the war was a year old. It's gone in April of 1862. When New Orleans is gone, the Mississippi is no longer a Confederate river. It's of no real use to the Confederacy. Nothing can come in, nothing can go out in terms of the Confederate commercial connections with the rest of the world. The loss of New Orleans ends the functional value of the Mississippi River. It takes until Vicksburg, more than a year, 14 months, for the river really to fall under United States control, and Lincoln really pushed that. That's something Scott, in what came to be called his Anaconda Plan, as you know, had pushed. Blockade the Confederate coast, take control of the Mississippi River, which would split the Confederacy, and then, if necessary, project United States military power deep into the Confederacy is the third part of that. It's the same strategy the United States followed in the war with Mexico, incidentally. This isn't something that Scott had never thought about. That's what the United States did in the war with Mexico. Well, that's how he thought in this one. And Lincoln followed him on the Mississippi part. Lincoln also he knew the United States had more of everything. Everybody knew it. Everybody but George McClellan. The 1860 census told people everything they needed to know about the United States. They knew how many people lived in every state. They knew how many were military-age white males. They knew where the manufacturing was. They knew everything. And so how McClellan could imagine that a nation with 5.5 million white people could field larger armies than one with 20 million white people has always seemed kind of odd to me. Lincoln, as he went through the war, would say, we're going to give you the greatest number of tools possible. Please apply them relentlessly across the board. That's what he tried to get people to do. Apply the greater United States power relentlessly and across the board. And in order to accomplish victory, this is the last thing I will mention about Lincoln, he was willing to give a great deal of autonomy, even to soldiers who had not proved loyal to him, who had not proved dependable, really, in any way. Soldiers he thought might bring victory. George B. McClellan, Joseph Hooker, Don Carlos Buell are examples of those kinds of soldiers. He was willing. He didn't let his personal feelings get in the way of allowing a soldier to succeed. The soldiers who didn't succeed, we can see in retrospect, had big red flags flying all along, but Lincoln, we can see things that he couldn't. He was willing to put aside, he had a big ego, he was willing to put aside his ego to get success. That's another attribute that a lot of presidents haven't had. I'll talk about one in a minute who didn't really have that. But Lincoln could do that. You all know the famous incident of Lincoln and Secretary of State William Seward going to see McClellan at McClellan's house. McClellan was gone. They were put in a side parlor. McClellan came home. He was told that the President and the Secretary of State were there. He went upstairs, didn't say anything to them, and then summoned his butler about 20 minutes later and said, "You can tell them that I would be happy to see them some other time." He put up with that. He never went back to McClellan's house again. But that's an astonishing bit of behavior on the part of a general. I don't even think Douglas MacArthur would do that. Not quite that. McClellan did. Lincoln let him get away with it. He was willing to put up with a lot. Davis had a perfect resume in contrast. Everything. He's a West Pointer. He's about 2 years separated from R.E. Lee at West Point. He commanded more men in battle than anybody except Joseph Johnston, who commanded an army during the Civil War. No one had commanded even a regiment in battle. Of all these guys who became Civil War commanders during the American Civil War, many of them were staff officers. They were like Lee. They literally never commanded anyone in battle as an officer of the line. Jefferson Davis had the Battle of Buena Vista. He was considered a war hero in the war with Mexico. He was a very imaginative and successful Secretary of War under Franklin Pierce. He chaired the Senate Committee on Military Affairs as a powerful senator from Mississippi. He had done about all you could do to prepare yourself to oversee a war as commander-in-chief. All of those things were on his resume. All of them. None had been on Lincoln's. Now, he has basic ideas as well. Initially, partly because of political pressure, he tried to defend all of the Confederacy and found out that that couldn't be done, the cordon defense. The Confederacy didn't have the resources to defend Arkansas and Florida and Texas and Virginia and every place else. He dropped that, even though there was always political pressure to defend every place. In the end, he supported gathering Confederate manpower in a few large national armies, positioning them at key points of threat, hoping that they could block the United States advances and perhaps find a way to strike a counterblow. Historians have called this either an offensive/defensive strategy or a defensive/offensive strategy. Just to confuse people, I think it's the formulation that makes more sense to me is the Confederacy is standing broadly on the defensive and hoping that there might be opportunities for successful counterblows that would harm the Union effort significantly. So gather your resources in national armies. When you think of Jefferson Davis, think of nation. Jefferson Davis is a nationalist. As we'll see in a minute, that's why he and Lee got along so well. They agreed completely about that. Anybody who clings to the notion that all you need to know about Robert E. Lee is that he's from Virginia to understand him, get that out of your mind right now. If you want to understand why he gave up his colonelcy of the 1st United States Cavalry in April of 1861, yes, the fact that he's a Virginian is critical. Once he puts on a Confederate uniform, he is an ardent Confederate nationalist. And he and Jefferson Davis are absolutely on the same page there, and that's crucial, as we'll see, to why they got along so well. Davis's it was a realist in many ways. I think there were two things that hurt his, and I think he was a good commander-in-chief for the most part, but he did a couple of things that he shouldn't have. And one is, he tried, I think in some ways he would have rather been a general than a president. I really do believe that. He would have been more comfortable, I think. And as a result, I think he tried to be both a general and a president. He tried to be not only commander-in-chief, but general-in-chief. The Confederacy has no general-in-chief until the last winter of the war. When it's too late, it doesn't make any difference by then. The United States has Scott, and then McClellan, and then Henry Halleck, and then a little interlude, and then U.S. Grant. Almost always has a general-in-chief, a general who commands all the armies of the United States. Confederacy does not have that. R.E. Lee is only an army commander. He and Grant are not, you can't really compare them in many ways during the war because Grant's responsibility is much greater than Lee's for the last year of the war. Jefferson Davis held too much of that. He tried to do too much. He tried to have his hand in too much in this great war. He tried to see too much paper that came across his desk. He needed to be willing to trust someone. But there is no one as general-in-chief until I think finally there's such a groundswell of support for Lee to have that. In the end, Lee gets it, but when he gets it in early 1865, there's not much he can do with it because Confederate resources have been so badly depleted by then. Davis also didn't have Lincoln's ability to put his ego aside. He had an enemies list, and some really important generals are on his enemies list. And I would have put him on mine too. Joseph Johnston, he'd be on anybody's enemies list, but he's on Jefferson Davis's. And Jefferson Davis's enemies list functioned like those roach traps that let things go in and don't let things go out. Once you're on Jefferson Davis's list, you're on it. And Gustav Teuton Beauregard was on it. I love to say his name. He's my favorite name from the Civil War. Gustav Teuton Beauregard. He's on the list. Johnston is on the list. Those are two of the 5 ranking officers in the Confederacy. That's a problem. If you are really at odds with 2 of your 5 ranking officers. He also tended to be perhaps too understanding of those who were very supportive of him. Loyalty was everything to him. Loyalty, absolute loyalty. The kind of loyalty that Lyndon Johnson demanded. And because there are some young people in the audience, I won't give Lyndon Johnson's definition of loyalty here in public, but Jefferson Davis would have agreed with it. Don't talk to the press, don't talk to politicians, don't talk to my enemies, don't go behind my back, don't agree, these are all the things you don't do if you want to stay in Jefferson Davis's good graces. Lincoln worked with a lot of generals who talked behind his back, went to the press, called him names. Lincoln knew it, they knew it, and Lincoln still worked with them. Jefferson Davis was not nearly as good at that as Lincoln was. So I think Lincoln has a little edge there. He has an edge with his ego. But overall, I think both of them, in very difficult circumstances, did very well. I can't think of anyone in the United States who would have done better than Lincoln. Doesn't mean there wasn't someone, maybe there was. I can't think of who that might have been, and I certainly can't think of anyone in the Confederacy who would have done a better job overall than Jefferson Davis did, in even more difficult circumstances than Lincoln had in some ways. I think they both did a good job. All right. Now, these 2 key relationships. Lincoln is searching for someone who will, at the very fundamental level, take United States superiority of manpower and material and apply it in such a way that the Confederacy cannot match it. If we apply our power that way, reasoned Lincoln, across the strategic landscape, they simply cannot match us because we do have 20 millions of people and they don't. So who will do that? Who will do that? That's what the story of the high command on the Union side is to a significant degree during the Civil War. The search for someone who will do that. And there are various officers that show elements of Lincoln's style of command relationships. in the Civil War. George B. McClellan is a perfect example of Lincoln's willingness to put up with a difficult fellow in pursuit of victory. I have a hard time with McClellan. There are people who love McClellan. I'm not one of them because I've read his letters. I defy any of you to read George B. McClellan's letters, which are conveniently published and edited by Stephen Sears. You can't read more than about 20 pages at a time without just going, damn it. I don't think Mrs. McClellan liked him because she saved his letters. And now we have his letters, which reveal him in all his unbelievably self-referential ugliness. I mean, someone who will actually say, I hope John Pope fails so I can succeed, is a problem. I think you should want John Pope to succeed for the nation, even if you don't like him, and even if you are overweeningly ambitious. But at any rate, Lincoln put up. He put up with McClellan. McClellan had virtues. He built a great army. He built the greatest army of the Republic in the summer of 1861. He built the Army of the Potomac, which, as all of you know, carried on its bayonets by far the greatest part of the heavy fighting of the Civil War among all United States armies. There are people who have irrational attachments to the Western armies, which did a fine job. Talk about all the fighting the Western armies did. The fighting was in the East. It was in the East because Lee was in the East. Wherever Lee is, that's where the blood flows. Flows on the Confederate side, flows on the United States side. And 40 of the 50 regiments that suffered the highest casualties in the Civil War on the U.S. side were in the Army of the Potomac. 40 of the 50. Make a list of it. Anyway, it's the Army of the Potomac. He built it. Then he wouldn't use it. And he instilled among the officers in that army his own culture. It's the McClellan culture that gets in the way of the Army of the Potomac for most of the war. It's a culture that prizes caution, not taking risks, trying to make sure everything is just right before you do anything. You know, all of us know, we're old enough to know that in life everything is never right. You have to do something at some point. You have to take a risk. That's not what happened with McClellan. McClellan always demanded more. He lectured Lincoln on political issues. He lectured him on emancipation. He lectured him on all kinds of things. He did not respect the divide between the military sphere and the civilian sphere in that regard. And Lincoln put up with him and put up with him and put up with him through the 7 days, which should have been a United States victory. And then finally at Antietam, he'd had enough without the pursuit. And he finally got rid of McClellan. But McClellan shows us what Lincoln was willing to put up with when people were telling him he's the man who's going to win the war. He's our smartest soldier. He's our best commander. He's our best commander. McClellan was 35 years old when he was made General-in-Chief of all United States armies. 35 years old. I promise you that will never happen again. It won't. I mean, it's a young man's war in many ways. Union generals even younger than the Confederate ones. He's a perfect example of that. A perfect example. But Grant is the example of how, if things go the way they're supposed to go, the system could work very well. Scott helped Lincoln learn. McClellan tried Lincoln's patience and finally went because he didn't deliver. What Grant shows us is that if you get a talented soldier who understands how this command relationship is supposed to function, together with a commander-in-chief who is willing to push and push and push, then you have your best chance for success. I cannot imagine United States victory without both of those men by the latter stages of the war. Early on, different things could have happened before various factors were in place, but at the end, I think you need both of them. In Grant, Lincoln found the anti-McClellan. He found, whereas McClellan always demanded more, Grant sent Lincoln this astonishing note early on that said, in effect, I know you're giving me everything you can give me. I know you want to win the war as much as I want to win the war. I'm going to do my best with what you're giving me. Lincoln must have danced around the executive mansion when he got that. He thinks I'm giving him all I can give him, which of course I am doing, and he'll do his best with what I give him. Grant also Whatever his personal predilections and political philosophy might have been, Lincoln's policies were his policies. The national policy is emancipation. Grant's policy is emancipation. The national policy is no retribution at the end of the war. Grant's policy at Appomattox. Maybe it would have been his policy anyway, but what he's doing at Appomattox is what Lincoln told him he met on the James just a few days earlier when Lincoln and Sherman and Grant and Admiral David Dixon Porter met. Grant does what his government says is the national policy. Sherman didn't. McClellan didn't. Grant did. He understood how that relationship worked. He understood and said, I know you're doing what you can for me. It's a remarkable partnership that develops, especially after Vicksburg, and especially after Lincoln, for a short time. Lincoln was an old Whig. Lincoln knew what the most famous Whig generals did in the mid-19th century. They did what James K. Polk was terrified they would do. They ran for president. And one of them was elected, both Virginians, Taylor, and one of them wasn't, Scott. But they did both run for president. Grant seemed to be a good presidential candidate. He was like Eisenhower. Both Democrats and Republicans thought Grant looked like a good potential. Nobody knew what he was. He's only voted once. He voted in 1856 for James Buchanan, the Democrat. But his reason for doing so was utterly unrelated to party politics. Buchanan was running against John Charles Fremont, and Grant explained it. He said, I didn't know Buchanan, but I did know Fremont. And so he voted for James Buchanan. When Lincoln was satisfied Grant did not have presidential ambitions, then the partnership really came together, and Lincoln said, in essence, you know, I am Grant's and he is mine for the rest of the war, and that's the way it played out. When Grant came east, he also had this wonderful grasp of how important civilian expectations were. Grant didn't want to fight the Overland Campaign when he came east. Grant's armies through the entire war in the West when he was there totaled 35,000 men. 35,000 total. Shiloh, Henry and Donelson, Chattanooga, Vicksburg, all of his campaigns. Lee's campaigns during that same period, 95,000 casualties for the Army in Northern Virginia. 35. Grant is not. Grant the Butcher doesn't become the Butcher until the Overland Campaign. What's the new part of the equation? It's R.E. Lee. You cannot be around R.E. Lee and have light casualties. That's a law. If you're around R.E. Lee, you're going to have heavy casualties. And Grant wanted to come and fight a war of indirection to strike the logistical capacity of the Confederacy. He figured out very quickly that the civilians in the United States demanded that he go head-to-head with Lee and smite the great rebel general, who was still seen as unbeatable despite Gettysburg. It's another measure of how unimportant Gettysburg was relatively at the time. He understood that, and so that's what he did. That's what the Overland Campaign ended up being. That was not his first choice. He did it because he knew that Lincoln was under tremendous political pressure to have that kind of campaign. And one of the many ironies in the Civil War is that it's by fighting the kind of campaign that the nation wanted, it almost destroyed the nation's will to wage the war. Because the Overland Campaign brought those endless casualty lists with no real sense of who was winning. And Richmond wasn't captured, and neither was Atlanta. And so Northern public morale plummeted. But he's doing what Northern public morale wanted in April and May, and what was the political imperative. In the end, Grant's overall plan re-elected Lincoln because Sherman captured Atlanta, because Philip Sheridan won that string of victories in the Shenandoah Valley between September and October. If it had just been up to Grant, Lincoln would not have been reelected. And of course, Lincoln didn't think he was going to be reelected in the summer, in that awful summer of 1864. But in the end, he did find a man who tried to apply pressure across the board and got the kind of pressure that allowed the great Republican victories in the election of 1864. And once those victories were in place with Grant and Lincoln both in the key positions, that's if you're looking for turning points, that's the final turning point. Republican success, Lincoln and Grant in charge, then I think it is a matter of time. It's still going to be months before the war's over. But those are the key components that need to be in place for the United States. Lincoln had found the person in Grant. Grant had proved to be the ideal soldier in a democratic republic. A gifted soldier, a resolute soldier, and a soldier who understood what his role was, and who ended up working seamlessly with his commander-in-chief for the good of the republic. On the Confederate side, you have the same thing with Davis and Lee. Some historians have argued that there was a good deal of tension between the two. I think they had a great relationship, primarily Lee's gifts as a military politician. Lee was in Richmond, right here where we are, as Jefferson Davis's principal military advisor in early 1862, as many of you know. He observed Davis close up. He understood what worked and what didn't work with Davis. He knew. Lee is very perceptive in that regard. He's like Ike in that regard. Ike could oversee, you know what Ike must have thought when he woke up and he thought, okay, it's a nice day. Oh, wait a minute, Patton and Montgomery are both under my control. How am I going to work with that? Well, Lee had that in the Army of Northern Virginia, all these egos, and yet everything works. There are no big public battles within the high command, nothing like the Army of Tennessee's succession of public bloodlettings at the high command level. Lee, if someone was a problem, you look up one day and they're not in the Army of Northern Virginia anymore. Where did Daniel Harvey Hill go? He was so proud. I remember reading Lee's Lieutenants as a kid, and I liked Daniel Harvey Hill. He said, you know, when somebody tried to get into the band, he said, denied. Shooters, not tutors needed. Tutors, T-O-O-T-E-R-S. I love that. I like Daniel Harvey Hill. I got to Chancellorsville, and he wasn't there anymore. And I went back to try to find out what had happened to him. Well, what had happened to him is that Lee had decided he's a good combat officer, but he is, pardon my language, a pain in the ass. In every other way, he's gone. I'm going to send him somewhere else. He's good at that. He was also good at reading his chief executive, and he got along with him. He gave him lots of information. He deferred to him in almost every way. He had this ability to make Davis think that some of Lee's ideas were Davis's ideas, and then Lee would say, that's a good idea. I think we should do that. And the result was that Davis gave Lee more latitude than he gave anyone else. The key things, there are two absolutely critical factors that allowed Lee and Davis to get along. One, apart from the fact that Lee read him well this way, one is that Lee won victories. That's the one thing that Lee does that no other Confederate general does. He's all by himself there. When someone asks you to list the successful Confederate Army commanders, it's easy. It only takes 3 letters to list all of them. You write Lee down and ask for the next question. Because another one, and that's a problem for the Confederacy. Davis wrote a fascinating letter to his older brother Joseph, right after Chancellorsville. Joseph, who was sort of a father, or at least an avuncular, maybe even a father figure for Jefferson Davis, he talked about what a great victory Chancellorsville had been, a victory against great odds, and yet Lee had won. He said, in a war like, a general, I can just paraphrase, in the true meaning of the word only comes along once in a generation. But in this great war of ours, we need several. And yet the only one he ever found was Lee. And so, of course, he gave Lee a little more latitude. Of course, he sided with Lee in April of 1863, when everybody wanted to weaken the Army of Northern Virginia to reinforce either Bragg or John C. Pemberton, and Lee said no. He used one of his careful phrases. He said sending strength from the Army of Northern Virginia to Pemberton's army, he said he was uncertain of its application. That's a wonderful way for Lee to say, are you out of your mind? You're going to take men from me? Fredericksburg, Chancellorsville. So you're going to take troops from me and give them to John Pemberton. Come on. And in the end, Jefferson Davis didn't. That helped Lee, the victories. The other thing, as I mentioned earlier, is that they absolutely agreed on a nationalist attitude toward how to prosecute the war. Right from the beginning. The Confederacy had bitter internal fights about the degree to which the central government should be able to trample on what would have been considered fundamental individual rights and liberties in order to fight the war. This allegedly state rights society put up with the most intrusive central government in American history by far until deep into the 20th century. Far more intrusive than the Lincoln government. And Lee and Davis are in lockstep. Yes, do that, do whatever it takes. Conscription. There had never been national conscription in the United States history. The United States government had never said, we're in a war. I would like you to put on a uniform. And you look at me and say, you know what? Go straight to hell. And, okay, I want you in a uniform then. It's your patriotic submission that the government relied on, your small R Republican virtue that would have you do your bit, but you wouldn't be compelled to do it. Lee and Davis and Lee took the lead in the spring of 1862 when all those Confederates who had enlisted for 1 year were about to get out. They said, no, we are going to have conscription, all white men, military age, and all of you guys who enlisted in good faith for 1 year are now in for 2 more years. And that's the biggest desertion spike of the war until the very end for the Confederacy, because there was a sense the government had broken faith. They'd broken a contract. Lee said, we have to do this. Davis said, we have to do it. Logistically, Lee at one point said, if it takes all the army of the nation to feed the soldiers, then no one else gets meat. If it takes all the meat to feed the soldiers, nobody else gets meat. We should take over all public transportation, he said. It should only be devoted to military needs. Only when those needs are met should there be any private use of railroads. These are radical ideas within a mid-19th century American context. And Lee and Davis are on board with those. In the end, Lee even said, if it takes arming some slaves in order to win the war so we can keep control of the rest of our slaves, then we'll do that too. This is something that abetted their good working relationship, is that they are on the side of whatever it takes, we do. There are a lot of letters from Lee to governors and other state officials that say, we need this in South Carolina, and Lee will say, no, we need it here. I don't care what you need in South Carolina. We need those troops in the Army of Northern Virginia, because what the Army of Northern Virginia does affects South Carolina. We are South Carolina in the Army of Northern Virginia. We're also Tennessee and every other state. And that's how you need to quit thinking about South Carolina and start thinking about the Confederate States of America. That's his attitude, and that's Davis's attitude, and that helps their relationship. They got along extremely well. They appreciated each other, I think, although they weren't. Lee had a much warmer personality and a better sense of humor than Jefferson Davis did, I think. But they have a good relationship, as do Lincoln and Grant. The war gives us these wonderful examples of how badly civil-military relationships can work in the midst of a great war. I've gone a little bit too long, so we only have 10 minutes of questions, or 15 if you stay longer. But it also has these examples of these relationships that work almost perfectly in terms of what's possible within the kind of structure both the United States and the Confederacy had. And these two show the very best. And we couldn't, unless you were rooting not to have a United States, you have to be awfully pleased that Grant happened to be in the same place as Lincoln, at least for the last year of the war, and a little bit more, because they're the key architects of victory, I think. And even then it was close. Even then it was close. But those two were absolutely necessary. And if you look, as I'll just say one more time, if you want to get a nice way into understanding the broader contours of the war and the ways in which non-military and military factors intersected, influenced one another, looking at these relationships will do it. It's a nice way to come at that question. It's a nice way to get a sense of how these two nations tried to move toward their individual goals. The goal of independence on the part of the Confederacy and of union on the part of the United States. All right, the floor is open for questions, or there's one right there. No applause, just the question. I'll repeat the question so we can...
Could you spend a little time and go into the decision to put Richmond as the capital of the Confederacy?
Yeah, what about the decision to make Richmond the capital of the Confederacy? The Confederacy, 7 states, as you know early on, the Cotton States, the Deep South States, and that's not, they need more than that. It's not even half of the slaveholding states. There are 15 slaveholding states in 1860, and the Confederacy initially comprises just 7 of them, and not the ones with the most people in them and so forth. Virginia is the most important slaveholding state by far. No one is confused about that. Everyone knows that. Virginia had been the most important state early in the history of the United States. It was the most populous state. There will never be another state that has the presidency 32 out of 36 years in a row. I'm pretty sure that will never happen again. I mean, Virginia, even in 1800, Virginia has more members of the House of Representatives than any other state, but by the time of the Civil War, it's tied with Indiana, so things have slipped. But among the slaveholding states, it's critical, and you get all kinds of things with Virginia. It's there are more white people, and there are 1 million white people in Virginia. 500,000 enslaved people in 1860, so that's a lot of bodies for the Army. You get this wonderful link to the Revolutionary heritage, which was essential to both sides. Both sides want to be right with the founders in 1861. And there are a lot of founders from Virginia, really important ones. Who's on the Great Seal of the Confederacy? Washington. Yes, and what George Washington? The George Washington from the statue on the Capitol grounds. Everybody wants to be right with Jorge, especially. And Virginia brings you that. Virginia brings you that. It also brings you Tredegar Iron Works, which all by itself represents 40% of the industrial capacity of the Confederate States of America early in the war. They'll build a wartime industry later, but you get all these things with Virginia. They also needed a city that was of a certain size. Montgomery was too small. There are only a handful of cities in the Confederacy that are even cities in the 11-state Confederacy. The greatest city is New Orleans. It's very vulnerable. And as we know it, it was gone within a year. Charleston is big enough, sort of. Has about 40,000 people, and so is Richmond. Has about 40,000 people in 1860. In essence, Alexander Stephens, talking to some Virginians and others, said, you know, if you'll join the club, you'll get to be the capital of the club. That wasn't the only thing that was in play, but that was an important one. Virginia you cannot overstate how important, and it was even more important than they thought. They got Tredegar with Virginia, and they got more soldiers than any other state gave, but they also got R.E. Lee. And R.E. Lee is why the war lasted as long as it did. R.E. Lee, this is another lecture, R.E. Lee's why Emancipation came during the war, because he lengthened the war long enough so that the mass of white Northerners would conclude that emancipation was necessary to defeat the Confederacy. The war almost ended right here in the summer of 1862. It should have. If it had been anybody but McClellan and anybody but Lee, if it had been, I hate to bash Johnston, if Joseph Eggleston Johnston had not been shot at 7 Pines on May the 31st, 1862, we know what he would have done. He woke up every morning and said, it's a great day to retreat. Which way shall I go? Richmond is 5 miles back here. He would have been in Richmond. And there's one thing George B. McClellan could do. He could lay siege to some place. You don't have to move. You just have to get close, and then you bring up the guns. Richmond would have fallen. The Confederacy could not have sustained the loss of Richmond in the summer of '62 in tandem with the catastrophic losses out west. By June 15th of 1862, New Orleans was gone, Memphis was gone, Nashville was gone, virtually all of Middle and West Tennessee were gone. There was an army of 100,000 United States soldiers in Corinth, Mississippi by the end of May 1862. The West, a catastrophe, a catastrophe. You add to that the loss of the capital, I think the war was over. I don't like counterfactuals, but I like that one. I think the war would have been over, and of course it would have been over. Why does emancipation really surge? That's in response to the failure of the 7 days. Second Confiscation Act comes right after the 7 days. Lincoln announces his ideas about a proclamation right after the 7 days. The 7 days signaled this war is going to be longer. It's going to require more radical measures to suppress the rebels. And emancipation was a way to suppress the rebels. Yes?
Why did Lincoln think 90-day volunteers could win?
Sure, why did Lincoln think 90-day volunteers could win? Because he didn't know anything. But lots of other people thought that too. Nobody, that's not true. Winfield Scott and Lee wrote letters to his wife in that first spring. He said, this war is going to last years. Winfield Scott said it too, but most people did not. There was nothing in their experience that would suggest that this would be a long, long war. And no one imagined, not even Winfield Scott, not even R.E. Lee, not even others, that it would take on the proportions it did. But Sherman, when he heard about the call for those volunteers, he said, you might as well try to put out a house fire with a squirt gun. He said, that's not going to work. But I think it's because there was so little experience. It had been a long time since there had been a war here. And it's just, people couldn't imagine that it would last, that it would become what it became. Let me see if there's okay, I was looking in the back, but it's quiet in the back.
I'm curious about the source of Davis's unwillingness and loyalty to not change generals and Lincoln's willingness. Where does that come from on both sides?
Well, the question is about the respective willingness or unwillingness to change generals. There are always a lot of factors in play. Let's use McClellan as an example. Lincoln he really had enough of McClellan after the 7 days. But then in the wake of the defeat at Second Bull Run, he needs someone who can pull the forces together around Washington, and McClellan is good at that, so McClellan comes back. Then Antietam. He wins a battle but doesn't follow up. That's what